Hello, welcome to On the Brink. This is Dean Brinkerhoff, and today I'm pleased to present to you my audio commentary for Walt Disney's 101 Dalmatians. As we begin, here's some historical context of the film. The time of this recording is January 2025. The release of the film was 64 years ago on January 25th, 1961. It's number 17 of Walt Disney's animated features. This film is impressive and important for the history following the studio in that it saved the animation department. Sleeping Beauty didn't make the money it needed to, and Walt Disney sadly felt the animation was becoming too expensive to continue, until the Xerox process was brought in to simplify the production process and save the needed money. The film saved them money and in turn had a great box office return. The article, Approximately 101 Reasons Why I Love 101 Dalmatians by Jim Fanning for D23, reads, a self-professed dog lover, Walt Disney naturally came up with a doggone good film when making a movie all about his beloved mutts. On more than one occasion, Walt appeared on his TV show with a canine co-star, and on the February 12, 1961 installment of his Walt Disney Presents series, Walt charmingly related the story of the film to a Dalmatian puppy with whom he had a purebred dog lover's rapport. In the book The Walt Disney Film Archives, in the chapter by Charles Solomon about 101 Dalmatians, he says, the debut of the UPA Studios short Ragtime Bear in 1949 had marked a turning point in American animation. The influence of modern art and artists, especially Picasso, and cartoonist illustrators Saul Steinberg and Ronald Searle, began to replace the traditional academic draftsmanship Disney had established as the industry standard during the 30s. In contrast to the rounded three-dimensionality of the Silly Symphonies and early Disney features, the characters in 50s cartoons were flatter, more angular, and more stylized. The backgrounds were simpler and even minimal. The crisp new style tied animation not only to contemporary fine art, illustration, and cartooning, but also to the modern aesthetic of industrial design. Even the Disney artists had begun exploring the new style in short films, including Pigs' Pigs in 1954, Paul Bunyan in 1958, and the Oscar-winning Toot Whistle, Plunk, and Boom from 1953. Amid the intricate Ivan Earl backgrounds, the characters in Sleeping Beauty were more angular and stylized than their counterparts in Lady and the Tramp just 4 years earlier. The new style also fit the contemporary setting of Dalmatians. One essential feature of the modern style Anderson envisioned was a new approach to line work, unlike anything in previous Disney features. Since 1915, the animators had drawn their characters on paper, and crews of women had traced the drawings onto cells, clear sheets of celluloid acetate that were photographed against the backgrounds. Over the years, the inkers developed beautiful calligraphic pen and brush lines, but the animators felt the inking process inevitably leached some of the life out of their work. Walt Disney's longtime friend and technical innovator Ub Iwerks was experimenting with and developing the Xerox method as a special process at the studio. Xerox previously had been used in Sleeping Beauty for the Thorn sequence and sneakily throughout the whole dragon fight. It was fully utilized first for the short animated film Goliath 2 in 1960. The Xerox process allowed the animator's drawings to be applied directly to a cell, instead of the process of inking them on completely by hand for painting. Meticulous tracing onto celluloid was required to produce an animated film before 101 Dalmatians went into production. The animators were pleased to be able to see their work directly on the screen in full sketchy glory, but some did not like the look of it. One particularly important individual was Walt Disney, who was extremely saddened by the lack of the fairy tale fantasy look his films once had. Based on the book The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith, published in 1956, Dodie Smith actually told Walt Disney that she wrote the book with the idea in mind that she would like to see Walt Disney make it into a film someday. Her vision became a reality when production began after it was brought to Walt's attention in 1957, the film finally released in 1961. Story adaptation was a one-man band for this film, Bill Pete. Bill was an extremely skilled story writer. He began at Disney in 1937 as an in-betweener and became quickly frustrated with that position. He eventually became a story man and was eventually seen as a senior story artist. He sometimes didn't see eye to eye with other story writers. His assignment on 101 Dalmatians was a major undertaking that really meant a lot to him. He liked being in control and having the creative freedom to make decisions and not have to endure a creative clash with the visions of others. Although not to forget that Walt Disney was certainly a major part in the helm of the story development. Dodie Smith was extremely pleased with the trajectory and eventual outcome of the film. According to Disney Publicity, there are 6,469,952 spots on the Dalmatians in all 113,760 frames of final film. In the D23 article, Painting of Spots, Huge Job in Producing, it reads, Pongo, the cartoon canine lead, wears 72 spots, while his love Perdita has 68 on her coat. The spots and all other color effects required 800 gallons of very special paint, weighing nearly 5 tons, enough to dress the exteriors of 135 average homes. Using a secret process, the studio has always mixed its own color in its own laboratories for all Disney cartoons. For 101 Dalmatians, 1,000 different shades were produced, 100 of them especially for that picture, to achieve the subtlety and variety needed to handle the dogs and humans as they move through interiors and exteriors in summer and winter. Producing the white for the dogs alone, Dalmatians are white under the spots, required enough very light gray paint to make this category the predominant one in the picture's broad spectrum. Pure white, of course, would have been too garish, too difficult to define, especially against snow. Made on a budget of $3,600,000, it was the top-grossing animated feature of its time. 8 of Walt Disney's legendary 9 old men worked on this film: Les Clark, Mark Davis, Ollie Johnston, Frank Thomas, Eric Larson, John Lounsbury, Milt Kahl, and Wolfgang Woolley Reitherman. Songwriter on the film, Mel Levin, came to the Walt Disney Studio at recommendation by veteran writer and storyman T. He after working together at UPA. He wrote the 3 songs that are in the film. He helped usher in some change, as this film wasn't considered a musical, and that's something that was a bit of a rarity at the time for a Disney animated film. The film had 3 main directors: Clyde Geronimi, who also worked on Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, etc., Hamilton Ham Lusk, all the same films minus Sleeping Beauty. He also worked on Fantasia and Pinocchio. And Wolfgang Woolley Reitherman, I'll refer to him as Woolley as I go forward, who also went on to work on The Jungle Book, The Aristocats, Robin Hood, and several other films. And according to the Walt Disney Film Archives chapter on the film by Charles Solomon, he says, in a letter to Walt, accompanied by a signed copy of the book, dated November 30th, 1957, Dodie Smith wrote, I want to tell you how very proud and happy I am that you're going to make a film of my book. To be quite honest, I always hoped you might, so much so that when I was writing it, I often found myself visualizing the scenes as they would be in a cartoon. Perhaps this helped to give them a certain pictorial quality. Walt replied to her a few weeks later, I know you will be happy when I tell you that your story is going into immediate production. It is entirely possible, and I am hoping that we will have it ready for release about Christmas time, 1960. I know that seems like a long time to be in production, but it takes an endless amount of time to develop a character, put on a personality into him, and make him come alive. Considering that Sleeping Beauty has been in work for almost 4 years, if we can finish up the Dalmatians by 1960, we'll feel pretty lucky. Walt Disney's 101 Dalmatians opened only a month after he estimated. Bill Pete, who wrote the screenplay for the film, a first for a Disney animated feature, recalled, Walt ran across the book when he was on a Caribbean cruise. Some friend of his gave him a copy and said he ought to read it. When he got back, he handed me a copy and said, "Here, why don't you read this?" Now that we've gotten some background on the film, I will shortly begin the film on the count of 3. And just as a disclaimer, if there are any errors or if any of you in the audience have any questions, please feel free to let me know in the comments. This commentary took a lot of research and I am very proud of it. However, I am human and prone to make mistakes, so excuse me if I misspeak or have any minor inaccuracies, but I really have put a lot of time and research into this, and I'm very excited to share what I have with you. So without further ado, let's start the film on 1, 2, 3. This is a very tight, concise film, so forgive me if I rush through some things, but I will do my best to pack in as many facts as I can and quotes. Bam. Right off the bat, opening title cards, Walt Disney presents, check out that hidden Mickey. The film, and especially the opening titles, would not have been possible without the Xerox process, as mentioned earlier. It was the most complex and expensive opening title sequence that Disney had done up to this point. That wide shot of all the Pongos and the title is extremely detailed and impressive for a company who is about to shut down animation production almost entirely because of lack of budget. Pure magic, wizard ingenuity. But we'll talk more about Xerox later on. There are 10 musical cues across this opening titles overture. Love Disney overtures, they're some of the best. A fun fact about the musical paw print notes that glide across the screen here in a second is that they are accurately playable to what you're hearing, and that musical cue is referred to as bloop bleep. Story by Bill Pete title card displays Bill's own handwriting on his card. Dodie Smith, the original author of the book, was a huge fan of the film and praised it highly in correspondence between she and Walt Disney. She only wished that her name wasn't so small on the title card. The credit for the spectacularly complex opening title sequence goes to Disney legend Hamilton Ham Lusk, who I'll refer to now as Ham Lusk through the commentary, who started at Disney in the year 1931. The Disney legend and wife of Mark Davis, Alice Davis, stated that she cried when they closed down the ink and paint department. In her opinion, it was the best one in the world. Now, I bring this up because Xerox is such an important piece of technological history in relation to this film. There's a book called The Queens of Animation by Natalia Holt, and there's a little bit I'd like to read about that. It reads, "Of the once vital crew of inkers at one time totaling more than 40, just 2 members remained. In the departed workers' place stood massive hunks of plastic, glass, and metal. Many women from all over the studio watched the rooms empty with tears in their eyes, as if brought in on purpose to cheer the forlorn staff. The studio was suddenly full of black and white spotted puppies. They ran around the studio wildly, played in the halls, and sometimes just napped quietly under the animators' desks. There were adult dogs, too, for the artists to admire, their coats shiny and their tongues hanging out in pure canine contentment. Walt was smitten with a book called The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. This time the studio was not adapting a fairy tale that had been retold over thousands of years, but a novel published in 1956. It included modern elements they had never incorporated into their movies before, such as television, neon lights, and contemporary music. The story felt refreshing to the artists. It was just the change they needed, and ideal for adaptation. There was a reason the book felt tailored to them. Dodie Smith had written the text with animation in mind, hoping the Walt Disney Studio might pick it up. She made the plot tight, in a slim volume of just 99 pages, full of personality, animals, and a villain that was suitably horrible. Yet, despite the story's advantages, the studio could not even have contemplated making the film just 5 years earlier. It would have been astronomically expensive for animators to draw 99 puppies over and over again, each one carefully inked. This opening sequence, Sequence 1, directed by Clyde Geronimi, is beginning with one of the few multiplane camera shots in the film. That camera that really gives depth and dimension to Walt's animated films. It's that opening pan down on Pongo's window as the narration begins. The scene here of Pongo on the window seat is one of author Dodie Smith's favorite scenes in the film. It's certainly one of mine to pause when Pongo stretches and you can see that fantastic detailed stretch line in Pongo's body as he opens his mouth so wide. And we can see from the Lilliput magazines on the window seat that Pongo's looking at that late 1958 is roughly when the events of this film take place. That magazine featured the work of all kinds of graphic artists from the 1950s and 60s, and according to Brian Sibley, it is a natural fit for the environment of this tale. It's no coincidence that it appears in the film. D23 has an article called 101 Dalmatians, Did You Know? It reads, 101 Dalmatians was the first Disney animated feature set in a specific place and contemporary time. Pongo says, my story begins in London not so very long ago. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty are set in fairy tale realms. Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland begin in London, sometime in the later 19th century. Lady and the Tramp is set around the same time in a fictionalized New England. Nothing indicates when Bambi takes place. The WPA influenced scenes of the roustabouts suggest Dumbo unfolds in the 1930s, but the location in Florida remains vague. It was the first Disney animated feature to have screenplay, 101 Dalmatians that is, by master story artist Bill Peet, who didn't particularly like the book when Walt gave it to him. It had a deadly beginning with the people, the Dearleys, and their 2 dogs. Who can worry about a perfect marriage with 2 perfect dogs with nothing to do but take walks together, Pete said. I decided to start the narrative from the dog's point of view. It's funny how Roger starts out the film being described as a romance songwriter, but we see later in the film he goes on to gain notoriety for his Cruella song. Ben Wright played the voice of Roger, who he's also the voice of Grimsby in The Little Mermaid several years later. Rama the Wolf, also in The Jungle Book, and Herr Zeller in Fox's The Sound of Music. He died in July 1989. Roger was animated by several legendary animators, Les Clark, Milt Kahl, and Frank Thomas. Also, Hal Ambro and Art Stevens. According to Charles Solomon's chapter in Walt Disney Film Archives, the use of modern graphics extended to the character designs, which are largely the work of Milt Kahl, assisted by Tom Oreb and other staff artists. At that time, Kahl was married to an art dealer and had become fascinated with Picasso. Andreas Deja, a Disney animator, remembers, when I visited him in the mid-'80s, he said, Picasso just overwhelms me. I could never think like him. There are some things he did that I think are just ugly. Other things completely overwhelm me. The influence of Picasso can easily be seen in Kahl's designs for the humans and dogs in the film. Pongo has a large squarish head and torso that plays straight lines against curves and angles. His impossibly long, thin legs stretch down to small paws. Pongo was drawn by top Disney artists Milt Kahl, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, Les Clark, Eric Larson, and John Lounsbury. 101 Dalmatians opens with a beautiful contemporary jazzy overture, which begins the score for the film. It was composed by George Bruns, a regular composer at the Disney studio beginning in the 1950s and going on for several decades. Some of his most well-known scores were for this Disney animated film, plus the animated The Jungle Book, Aristocats, and Robin Hood. For some live-action Disney examples, he composed for The Love Bug, The Absent-Minded Professor, Babes in Toyland, and the Davy Crockett films. He had so much characterization and musical cues to the film that are perfectly placed. The opening narration was done by Australian Rod Taylor, who, in addition to the narration, simultaneously is the voice of Pongo. Backgrounds are by art director Ken Anderson. His production design was top-notch, and it shouldn't be taken lightly to say that his is the work of genius. Absolutely remarkable. He's also known for Snow White, Pinocchio, The Sword and the Stone, all for production design. Contributed also to the story for Cinderella, The Jungle Book, and the Winnie the Pooh featurettes. Ken, of course, is remembered for being the guy who entered studio lore for accidentally setting Walt Disney's mustache on fire with his new cigarette lighter in the early days of the studio. Mark Davis remembers Ken as a tremendous talent, but if it was possible for anyone to consistently do the wrong thing at the right time, it was Ken. Ken's credit on the film is his first such credit for the overall art direction. His drawn, contemporary look to the art complements the animation drawings that were xerographically reproduced. The backgrounds were painted in a looser, modern style. The painting technique for 101 Dalmatians, flat areas of color to match the handling of the flat values on the characters, with all the details and drawing left in line on a covering cell. This color style for the backgrounds was mainly handled by Walt Paraguay, who worked directly along with Ken Anderson to bring this to life. According to The Queens of Animation by Natalia Holt, Walt was not so pleased. The styling, he believed, was reminiscent of what they'd made in the 1920s, when animation was in its infancy and crude lines were acceptable. For decades they had worked to get rid of any stray marks on the cell, and they'd improved their techniques until the dreaded outlines vanished into the colors around them. Inkers had used colored lines with great skill so that every feature was rendered lifelike. Now, thanks to the Xerox machines, the black lines were back and they were everywhere. Production had gone too far, and Walt had been distracted, but it was too late to start over now. Still, he had strong words for the future. "We're never going to have one of these things," he grumbled. "Ken's never going to be an art director again." The appreciation for xerography, however, was clear. 101 Dalmatians had been made in record time. Given the contentious environment, perhaps it's not surprising that Anderson accepted Walt Disney's offer to take a break from feature films and design rides at Disneyland. 101 Dalmatians had been made in record time, going from start to finish in a mere 3 years. Even more impressive, with a budget of $3.6 million, the movie made $6.2 million on its release. Xerox technology effectively saved animation at the Walt Disney Studios. George Brunn's recurring playful melody theme was recorded and released on Disneyland Records with lyrics. The lyrics were "All the bells in the town are ringing. Say, can't you hear all the people singing? 'Cause of the way the band can play that playful melody." The sequence 2, Introduction to Cruella, was developed by Ham Lusk. Lisa Davis played the voice of Anita. Lisa originally read for the voice of Cruella de Vil, but ultimately didn't feel like she was a great fit for the role, so she instead suggested Anita and tried out for it, and it was a great fit. The character design of Anita incorporates features of Lisa Davis into her look, and she was animated primarily by Milt Kahl, who was an expert in human animation. He was aided by animators Les Clark, Hal Ambro, and Ollie Johnston. Jim Fanning's D23 article also says Milt Kahl was specifically assigned by Walt Disney to both redesign and animate Dalmatian devotee Anita, and the master animator based his design in part on Julie Andrews, then famed as the star of Broadway's My Fair Lady. Little realizing that in just a few years, Julie would be at the Disney Studios herself, starring in Mary Poppins in 1964. Milt also used his fellow Nine Old Men team member, piano-playing Frank Thomas, as a model for songwriter Roger Radcliffe. Cruella de Vil is sung by Bill Lee as Roger's singing voice. He's also a singing card painter in Alice in Wonderland, a singer in the dog pound scene of Lady and the Tramp, an uncredited ram in Mary Poppins, for the singing voice of Shere Khan in The Jungle Book, for several attractions at Disney parks like Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room and the Haunted Mansion. And he also sang for Captain Von Trapp in Fox's The Sound of Music. Mark Davis animated Cruella de Vil. John Canemaker is quoted as saying that deliciously wicked Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians is Davis's masterpiece and also his swan song as an animator. Mark was inspired by character actress Mary Wickes, who portrayed Cruella in live-action reference footage. She donned the costume, complete with the black and white wig from the book. Previously, Mary Wickes portrayed Katie, the housekeeper, in the Annette serial from the Mickey Mouse Club. Betty Lou Gerson provided the voice of Cruella. Previously, she had provided the opening narration of the opening of Cinderella. Cruella's cigarette holder was modeled after a signature one Mark had used himself. Mark also added these qualities: more appealing attitudes, better drawing, and the convincing movement that came with this drawing ability. He saw a unified relationship of all parts of a character, and on the flamboyant Cruella de Vil, made use of everything from her bony elbows to her posturing through her erratic movements. John Grant's background on Cruella de Vil from his Encyclopedia of Disney Characters says, "What can you say about Cruella de Vil? Probably the finest Disney villain of them all?" Well, over the years, people have said quite a lot about her, most notably Mark Davis, whose screen creation she was. The reviewers and the public agreed for once on a Disney character. As one critic put it, the real triumph of the film is Cruella de Vil. She's one of the most evil, especially since, unlike the witches in Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, she's very much a monster. So, while of today unendowed with magical powers, she's human, and all the other trappings of that golden past, which in fact never existed, she was born from the imaginations of not only Mark Davis, but also, of course, Dodie Smith. A fact that Disney buffs are prone to forget, although Davis himself did not. While Cruella was a marvelous villainess, she was still entertaining. Her black and white hair, her coat, came from her with the book. It was a matter of bringing together a character that could perform a certain role, but always be consistent. Andreas Deja is quoted as saying, "Mark was an expert in depicting the human form, and therefore in demand at the studio. Because human roles are the toughest to bring to life, Mark was often assigned to take on those tasks. However, the precision with which he drew the human body was honed through his in-depth studies of the entire animal kingdom." It's ironic that he ended up drawing humans so often, because he was very, very masterful at animals. Lisa Daniels voices Perdita for about a third of the film. Kate Bauer did have to take over for her voice after Lisa married and moved to New York. Perdita was animated by Mark Davis, Les Clark, Eric Larson, Frank Thomas, Ollie Johnston, Milt Kahl, and John Lounsbury. Ollie, in particular, loved, I should say, sadly, to mention the scene where Perdita is under the stove, and felt that that limited space for her to move in actually ended up being the perfect spot to animate that scene. This is sequence 3, The Puppies Arrive, and it's directed by Clyde Geronimi. After author Dodie Smith's own Dalmatian family had a litter of 13 to 15 puppies, the 13th was born lifeless. Smith's husband, Alec Beasley, wrapped the puppy in a towel, and by gently massaging the puppy, he brought it back to life, just as it's represented as part of the story in this film. According to Charles Solomon, she remembered the tiny, unmoving puppy, and she remembered her friend, character actress Joyce Kennedy, saying of Pongo in jest, "He would make a nice fur coat." The 101 Dalmatians was published in November 1956 and was an instant critical and commercial hit. The quick scene of the unspotted puppies near the end of the sequence is a phenomenon that happens when they're born. Dalmatians are actually native to the country Dalmatia, which is a part of Croatia as far as I understand. So it's funny, it is a real place, Dalmatians from Dalmatia, which is actually a point of interest for Disney fans, as it's one of the most misspelled Disney words, according to Chief Archivist Dave Smith. In Charles Solomon's chapter in the Walt Disney Film Archives book, he has a section where Brad Bird, director of The Incredibles, talks about summarizing the power of that focused simplicity when he comments, "If you look at the drawings of Roger's apartment, they tell you everything you need to know about Roger, and you don't even have to see Roger to know who Roger is. It's clear he's a bachelor, it's clear his interest is in music, and it's clear that he spends a lot of time working. And he's engaged in his work rather than his surroundings, so they have kind of a messy, haphazard artistic thing going on there. It's very English. The constant cups of tea piled on each other like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's great." Here in a second, Roger and Pongo get sprayed by a bunch of ink thanks to Cruella's pen that isn't working. I think it's so funny, a clever, hilarious scene that you can tell that Pongo is covered in additional spots, and it just flashes for a few seconds there on the screen. Mark Davis was responsible also for two others of the great Disney women, Cinderella and Maleficent, and has often been asked to compare Cruella with these two. Comparing her with Cinderella, in an interview with Kurt Wiley, he said that characters like Cinderella were unsatisfying for an animator because they don't get laughs. When you do something in animation and the whole audience laughs at one time at something you've done, it's a tremendous thrill. That's why I love doing a Cruella de Vil, because she was erratic, eccentric, and violent. You didn't have any restrictions of trying to keep her innocent and believable because she was an action character. She'd come in and go out and leave havoc wherever she went. She was a funny villainess, and I think people enjoyed her even though she was a monster and wanted to make fur coats out of those puppies. In an interview with A. Eisen, David complained of Maleficent that the difficulties in animating her included that she always acted on her own. Not so with Cruella. Cruella was comparatively simple. She was always working with somebody, slapping them around or whatever. Being able to draw a little better than any of the other men, I sometimes got sidetracked onto the more difficult to draw characters, which are not always the most fun. Note, in this latter comment, Davis is not being boastful. He's talking of drawing rather than animation. Although he did have quite a rivalry with Milt Kahl. As his best friend in the animation business, they liked to one-up each other from time to time. Cruella is a fabulous caricature. Her desperately thin body is a physiological impossibility, yet is perfectly attuned to her character, so that no viewer worries about this. Her cheekbones, were they any higher, would brush her temples. Her voluminous fur coat dominates the screen. Her ubiquitous cigarette holder is probably best measured in parsecs, and her presence is marked by the clouds of evilly swirling cigarette smoke which surround her. Sequence 4 is the introduction of Puppies, directed by Ham Lusk. The Thunderbolt TV series is a clever homage by Disney artists of westerns and heroic dog shows that were popular in the 1950s. Here's some background on the Puppies. The 7 dwarfs were a triumph in Snow White because they each had definite personalities. Giving 99 puppies separate identities would have been a fairly tall order, but nevertheless, 7 of them can be picked out. 6 of these are among Perdita's litter of 15, the 7th, Rover, being not really a named character. He or she is the puppy first approached by Sergeant Tibbs in Hell Hall, and who explains to him the situation. Tibbs initially attracts the pup's attention by hissing, "Rover, Spotty." The 6 noteworthy offspring of Perdita are Rolly, Patch, Penny, Lucky, Freckles, and Pepper. Rolly is, well, roly-poly. He's always mentioning that he's hungry, even at the most inopportune times, as when the dogs are trekking through the snow. When the puppies are being fed by the 3 cows, Rolly is furious not to be first at the udder. Lucky has a habit of not being. He is the one on whom the meltwater falls to wash away the soot, but his most notable feature is his addiction to television. Both at the Ratcliffe's home and in Hell Hall, he persists in putting himself between the screen and whoever else happens to be trying to watch. Patch is likewise keen on television, although as with the other puppies, he's not as addicted as Lucky. We notice him primarily because of his vivid way of describing the niceties of thespianism. Canine and Crunchy's jingle is sung by voice actress Lucille Bliss. She previously provided the voice of Anastasia, one of the wicked stepsisters in Disney's Cinderella. In Jim Fanning's D23 article, he quotes Eric Larson. "I just thought of what regular kids would do as they watch TV and took it from there," Eric said. One of the pups sits directly in front of the set, blocking everyone else's view. Another is constantly hungry. Their emotional attitudes were the attitudes of youngsters. With the parents, I tried to reflect back on how my parents treated me. It was a lot of fun doing that scene. Patch was a favorite puppy of mine. Personally, this is Dean speaking again, because of having to patch my eye as a child due to my strabismus in my left eye. In English, that's like crossed eyes or a lazy eye. So Patch was a fun character to emulate. Dirty Dawson was voiced by Paul Frees. The names of all the Dalmatian puppies I mentioned earlier, but there are ways to tell them apart a little bit. The boy pups wear red collars like Pongo. The girls wear blue collars like Perdita. Patch has that black patch around his eye. Lucky has 2 black ears and a horseshoe-shaped pattern on his back. Rolly's a bit pudgier than the others. Freckles has a few spots on his nose. Penny has the fewest spots of all. And you're on your own for the rest, and that's courtesy of Jeff Curdy in his Disney Dossiers book. Jeff also says these pups may be difficult to tell apart, but from the moment the first 15 of them arrived during a dark and stormy night, their individual personalities were set. Now, before the TV announcer is cut off with the hilarious animation of him disappearing into the TV set with a wild expression, he was written to say, send just 5 canine crunchy box tops and 1 shilling, and this fabulous silver-studded Thunderbolt dog collar is yours. Moving into sequence 5, Puppies Stolen. That was directed by Wolfgang Wooly Reitherman. Excuse me, I'm going to refer to him as Wooly, I promise. Wooly has Jasper and Horace Baden here in his opening scene. They're voiced by J. Pat O'Malley and Fred Warlock. Their chief animators were John Lounsbury and John Sibley. Now, Nanny is played by Marta Wentworth, who later provided the voice of Madame Mim in Disney's The Sword and the Stone. Barbara Luddy played the live-action study footage of Nanny. She was also the voice of Lady. Barbara was also the voice of Lady in Lady and the Tramp and Merryweather in Sleeping Beauty. Nanny's chief animators were Ollie Johnston, Don Lusk, Cliff Norberg, and Eric Clayworth. When the puppies are first kidnapped, the apartment goes immediately to black and white. This is a quote from Paul Felix. It's all tone. It has an immediate and really strong impact. Charles Solomon again, from the Walt Disney Film Archives chapter, first shares a quote from Ollie Johnston, who says, Bill Pete's story sketches were staged beautifully. They suggested attitudes and acting, just a great springboard for the animators. Charles goes on to say, Pete was considered the best storyman in the studio, only second to Walt himself. Joe Grant, the head of the character model department, which served as Walt's think tank for the story development, said, Bill Pete could do a storyboard, and if you ran your eye across it, you'd see it animate. He was that good, and he was a great inspiration to the animators. But as a personality, I guess truculent would be a good word. He was well aware of his talent. He thought of himself on a pinnacle, and oddly enough, that's where he belonged. Brad Bird, the Oscar-winning director of The Incredibles, adds, Bill Pete was the greatest storyman in feature animation. He had an unerring ability to get to the heart of a story, and his drawings overflowed with character and feeling. Animation and the art of film storytelling owe him a lot. Walt trusted Pete not only to write the adaptation, but also to draw the first storyboards. Initially, Pete was less than enthusiastic about the book, its narrative rambles, as I mentioned earlier. I do have a lot of background on Cruella, and going back to John Grant's Encyclopedia of Disney Characters, it says, her public school English voice, supplied by Betty Lou Gerson, is utterly perfect because unlike her screen image, it is not overstated. This dichotomy between the two treatments is brilliant, and adds immeasurably to the power of Cruella's portrayal. In fact, on the basis of the voice and dialogue alone, one can meet a Cruella at virtually any upper-crust gathering in the British Isles, and probably in any other country. Totally egocentric, totally ruthless, totally impervious to any outside ideas, totally prepared to override any objections to her behavior. It is because every member of every audience has encountered, to their regret, someone like Cruella, that her character works so well. Davis, who animated her, says, I had several partial models in mind when I drew Cruella, including Tallulah Bankhead, and one woman I knew who was just a monster. She was tall and thin and talked constantly. You never knew what she was saying, but you couldn't get a word in edgewise. What I really wanted to do was make the character move like someone you wouldn't like. I love that quote because it's really true. I have definitely encountered people similar to Cruella, one being an old store manager of a store I used to work in. And boy, oh boy, literally to the T, it's incredible that everyone has met somebody like that. It's quite unfortunate, but I guess that's life. This is sequence 6, Dogs Make Decision, directed by Ham Lusk, where Cruella's in bed talking on the phone. Cruella's red phone has a great evil-looking design that matches her so well. It's a fun and clever detail that, at first, watch out, its face is smiling at first, but after her call with Horace and Jasper, it becomes an angry-looking expression. So funny of a little detail to add in. Now, Ollie, Johnston, and Frank Thomas have an amazing book, The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation, and in it, they talk a lot about Walt and this film, and thinking creatively. They say, Walt had to pull his storymen back and teach them new values of warmth and believability. He still wanted fresh situations and funny predicaments, but he also wanted his characters to achieve maximum identity with the audience. This type of thinking is the ultimate in creativity. A challenge to the storyman, plus the stimulation of Walt's constant pressure not to deliver, but to search and probe and discover, kept an air of constant excitement in the story department. It is not too difficult to think of cute bits of business that Dalmatian puppies might do, especially when there are 15 of them in one family. But the big idea that has them all watching television like any family of kids is unique and comes from a rare talent. The idea goes further, for the program they are watching is a series featuring their idol Thunderbolt, the Wonder Dog. The audience has no trouble accepting this, since they have seen it in their own homes night after night. It is completely believable and offers endless possibilities for business, personality touches, gags, and something entirely new on the screen. More than that, it is a warm, happy sequence that will play into the evil suspense of the puppies all being kidnapped immediately following. Maybe it is not genius, but it certainly is creativity. Many people contributed ideas to that sequence, with Walt leading the way. But the storyman on all of 101 Dalmatians was the talented, pungent, irascible humorist from Indiana, Bill Peet. He shared some of Walt's feelings for farmlands, and his characters were always somehow real and down to earth, no matter how fantastic the concept. His amazing powers of observation enabled him to catch the essence of everything he drew, whether it was a boxcar on a freight train or a Bavarian dwarf living under a lily pad. Sequence 7, Pongo Sends Message, was directed by Ham Lusk. This sequence, Twilight Bark, was sequence 7.1 and was directed also by Wolfgang Reitherman. As far as I can tell, it stands in place for an unseen sequence 8. And this is all from the fun facts on the DVD, so it's a little interesting to me that there's a 7 and then 7.1. I don't know if that's a mistake, but I'm rolling with it. The first links in the chain are the dogs seen earlier in the movie when Pongo was prospecting for mates himself and Roger. They include Prissy, an Afghan hound who much resembles her art student owner, and Coco, a fancified poodle who reflects her fancified owner's fancified lifestyle. Danny, the Great Dane of Hampstead, is voiced by George Palling. Jock, Peg, Bull, and Lady herself all are seen participating in the Twilight Bark here in a minute, all from Lady and the Tramp. I haven't received official confirmation from any source that Tramp is in the scene too, but he appears to be the dog on the top of the car at timestamp 36 minutes and 40 seconds. Coming up is a dog named Towser. He's played by Tudor Owen. He's an actor well known for How to Marry a Millionaire and How the West Was Won. Also, he plays a knight in Disney's The Sword and the Stone. Marta Wentworth, the voice of Nanny in the film, also voiced Lucy, the white goose, and Queenie, one of the cows that the Dalmatians encountered during their escape from Cruella later in the film. Going through all of the voice actors here in the scene upcoming, Captain the Horse is played by Thurl Ravenscroft, a great Disney legend that you'll hear in a lot of different places. Dave Frankham also plays Sergeant Tibbs, the cat, and he is a well-known British actor who also starred in Disney's 10 Who Dared from 1960. As of the recording of this audio commentary, he's still with us. I've had the pleasure of interacting with him on Facebook. I hope that maybe he'll end up watching this commentary. Maybe one day I can hold an interview with him or something. He's a big fan of cats, And Star Trek fans may remember his performance as Dr. Lawrence Maverick in the episode Is There in Truth No Beauty? In addition to Jasper Baden, one of Cruella de Vil's minions, the Colonel is played by J. Pat O'Malley. He's also the Walrus in The Carpenter in Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland, Cyril Proudbottom in the Wind in the Willows segment of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, Colonel Hathie, another colonel, in The Jungle Book, some uncredited roles in Mary Poppins, and in Robin Hood. A fun role he also played was Perkins in The Adventures of Spin and Marty on the Mickey Mouse Club. Going back to an earlier quote from Frank and Ollie's book, they talk about fellow storyman and sketch artist Ralph Wright, and it continues, who is better known for his great gags in the Goofy pictures, once said that Bill Peet was one of the few who dreamed up real live characters that lived and breathed, and Bill Peet always had a strong overall concept of the story material that integrated the humor in both the characters and the situation. Rather than spot gags, his integrity drove him to search out an idea that lifted the situation out of the commonplace, and still left the door open to further development in this new direction. Yet, after conceiving all this in his mind, he could reject the entire notion if it did not work within the other parts of the story. As both sketch artist and storyman, Bill had a unique talent for finding an entertaining way to tell a story in situations that could be well animated. The Twilight Bark sequence is a great, wonderful, full of magic scene, and it's fun to see all the dogs talking to each other and communicating as the other animals assist. And one that sticks out a lot to people, I think, in watching it throughout the years. Lots of charming voice work from the actors I previously mentioned, and wonderful animation. I love how the Colonel can't see, but yet he's got this wonderful ability to communicate across miles and miles with his barking. For Sequence 9, upcoming, Pongo Gets the News, it was directed also by Wooly Reitherman. In The Illusion of Life, by animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, going back to that again, they say for 101 Dalmatians, scenes were shot of a dog running upstairs, stopping and turning, coming down the stairs, straining on a leash, all of which were definite aids in timing scenes for the picture and assisting animators to achieve natural appearing action. But the scenes that brought the characters to life were the ones imagined by the animator, showing what the dog could have done, in ways the dog would have done it. In addition to movements needed for scenes and continuity, many miscellaneous actions were filmed in trying to capture something of the individual animal's own personality. These natural movements proved to be the most helpful, since special meaning could be given to them by adding dialogue or music or sound effects, thereby injecting an extra quality into the behavior. As the Colonel and Sergeant Tibbs approach Hell Hall, here in a minute, we'll be seeing that the puppies of Pongo and Perdita are all huddled around the television as they're used to. And on the screen, they're watching a silly symphony called Springtime from 1929, which is a Walt Disney silly symphony film, directed by Ub Iwerks. It's often mistaken by Disney fans for Flowers and Trees, which it's not. The easy way to distinguish them is that Flowers and Trees was shown in Technicolor and was released in 1932. Now, Springtime was a black and white film. In Charles Solomon's chapter, again from the Walt Disney Archives, he talks a little bit about Ub Iwerks. Ub Iwerks spent several years modifying a Xerox photocopy machine to create a new method of transferring the animator's drawings. Electricity and chemicals were used to fix the lines of black powder onto the cells. The powder never adhered perfectly, and a certain amount flaked off, giving the lines a slightly broken, friable quality. Crews then painted the cells using the traditional acrylic colors. The animators were delighted to have their drawings appear on the screen. After watching scenes of Cruella de Vil, Davis said, "To see my own drawings up there was a very exciting experience." Going on with that chapter, he mentions to increase the unity of the film's look, the lines and the backgrounds were also done using the Xerox process. Paul Felix says the crumbling lines help to suggest the age of London. There's a lot of beautiful stipling effects in the aged woodwork and the boot scrapers. It's really evocative and makes it feel rich and lived in. They grouped areas of detail together so every composition has a really pleasing balance of empty space and detailed space that feels more closed. The quality of the line work seems very Searle influenced and it just feels modern. A lot of the color schemes are very different from what Disney had been doing, with very subtle nuances of color temperatures playing off each other. It feels like it had to come from what was happening in the art world at the time. Felix also notes that while the layouts and backgrounds of Dalmatians may be less detailed, they effectively support the mood of the story. There's something about the abstraction of the mood they got from separating the color from the line work that's really interesting. When the puppies are escaping, there's lots of magenta spilling over into the furniture in the abandoned mansion, but there's no real attempt to do any modeling of the forms. I love the line from Horace and Jasper, the Battens, "Sharp's the word and quick's the action." Lots of fun action and wild chaos in the scene, and I can't believe the crowd animation that was able to be accomplished with the Xerox process. Completely impossible task before in keeping track of all of the puppies and their spots. Absolute magic. Considering it took 3.5 years to create this film, a lot of work went into it, but if you think about the more than 300 artists working on the film, all the work they would have had to do without Xerox, the film would have, who knows, taken twice as long, triple as long. It's fascinating to think about. According to the fun facts on the Platinum DVD, there were no sequences 10 or 11. So I wonder, from my own personal speculation, why that was, if there was perhaps a series of scenes that were deleted. That's my only theory I can come to. I know strange things can happen in a film production. Just found that fascinating that we move into sequence 12 here in a few minutes, Cruella at Hell Hall, which was directed by Clyde Geronimi and Ham Lusk. It's important to point out in a film called 101 Dalmatians that we've seen 99 puppies, plus Pongo, who makes 100, and Perdita, 101. The 15 puppies that come from Pongo and Perdita specifically are the original kin. A total of 1,112,000 pencils were used in the making of this film, approximately, and 800 gallons of paint. That's enough to cover 15 football fields, in addition to another 135 houses, I think I said earlier. Or that's another way of saying it, I suppose, not in addition to. Going back to Charles Solomon, he's got a lot for us today in his chapter in the Walt Disney Film Archives. The use of xerography also made it possible to create 99 Dalmatian puppies. Traditionally, animation directors avoided crowd scenes, as drawing large numbers of background characters was simply too much work for too little reward. Animator Andreas Deja explained, the Xerox process enabled them to multiply the animator's drawings, so they would maybe animate 3 puppies and turn them into 15 or 20 or 50, or however many they needed. Animator Ted Berman was assigned to make organic-looking crowds out of 3 or 4 puppies. He had to offset their motions so they didn't look like they were all doing the same thing at the same time. Oscar-winning Warner Brothers director Chuck Jones commented dryly, Only Disney would do a picture with 101 spotted dogs. We'd have had trouble doing a picture with one dog with one spot. Jones' sardonic remark reflects a very real problem the Disney artists faced. In live action, a spotted dog requires no more effort to film than a solid-colored one. But in animation, artists have to draw each spot and keep one in the exact same position on the character in every one of the thousands of drawings. Deja explains the character animators didn't have to worry about the spots on the dogs. They were done by the effects animators, who had to understand anatomy because the spots move with the muscles and change shape. There's a wonderful book about Mark Davis, Renaissance Man, and in it describes Mark as a very gentle person, but with the strong convictions that he holds to tenaciously. As animator of Cruella de Vil, he has a special sense of humor that usually has some unexpected twist to it. He is a very successful teacher, specializing in drawing for animation. If it's a prince or a hero or a sympathetic person who needs acceptance from the audience to make the story work, then the character must be drawn realistically, but not necessarily in a restricted manner. Roger and Anita had to be treated as real people because of the genuine concern they had for their pets, yet they were drawn with less realism than the prince in either Snow White or Cinderella. The design of the whole picture, as well as the treatment of the story, permitted the animator more freedom in representation. The Baddens in Cruella de Vil had broader roles and could be drawn with more caricature, which immediately made them more interesting and stronger. Now, in the book, Horace and Jasper were addicted to watching TV programs such as What's My Crime, which is a parody of What's My Line, which ran on U.S. television from 1950 to 1967. Disney cleverly animated this into the film. Walt Disney himself was once a mystery guest on the show What's My Line in episode 336, which aired on November 11th, 1956. Among other notable figures and celebrities of the time, such as Judy Garland, as simply an example. You can find clips of his appearance on YouTube. Betty Lou Gerson not only provided the voice for Cinderella, but also for Miss Birdwell, a panelist on What's My Crime. Tom Conway voices the Quizmaster as well as an upcoming collie. There's some background on What's My Crime from the Encyclopedia of Disney Characters by John Grant. It reads, the second program is the favorite of the Baddens, What's My Crime? It features a pushy quizmaster. Paul Wexler did live-action modeling for this part. Most studios would not have gone to this trouble. As well as a panel of hopeful questioners, Miss Birdwell, Mr. Simpkins, and Inspector Craven. But the real star is the crook who is put in the hot seat and has to face their penetrative questions. A certain Percival Fountswater. If this name should sound distinguished, all of Percival's pretensions to grandeur are destroyed before us, for the Baddens know him well. What's My Crime? Sequence 13, Escape from Hell Hall, was directed by Wooly Reitherman. No one ever doubted that Cruella de Vil would actually skin those puppies, Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston explain in The Illusion of Life, Disney Animation. Yet this did not keep her from being a wild, fascinating figure who could get laughs. You react to the evil characters, but with the sympathetic characters. The same is true of Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians, and she is a comic villain. Few of us could share her compulsion to skin puppies to make a fur coat, yet we were completely involved in her sequences. Because of our fascination with her explosive personality and our enjoyment with her outlandish behavior, appearance, and actions, she was funny without losing either her menacing quality or her audience. Whether people thought she was horrid, ridiculous, or wonderful, they all sat enraptured. Animate 3 feet of warmth. It cannot be analyzed or acted out or represented in the same way as an expression or a passing thought, since it is more of a sentiment that grows within the viewer from the special way the business has been animated. Actually, it grows from the sensitivity of the animator who makes the drawings. It is undoubtedly one of the most important factors in bringing the audience close to the characters. desperation will not be displayed always through frantic action or panic. At times it is numbing despair, and that presents an even greater challenge to the animator. In 101 Dalmatians, it becomes necessary to have a very delicate, sincere, and convincing sequence, showing the expectant female Dalmatian Perdita reacting to the news that Cruella de Vil is planning to take all of her puppies as soon as they are born. The storyman had felt that the dog's normal reaction would be to hide somewhere in the house, in some location that offered a tiny sense of protection. He made a drawing of her under the kitchen stove way back in the corner. Then, as I said earlier, they go on to say this was Perdita's emotional response to the near panic she felt at the thought of losing her puppies to this horrible woman. She could do nothing but remain passive. Wooly Reitherman loved scenes of great action and sometimes referred to it as the great danger. Coming up, I love the red, moody room in the sequence. It feels so dangerous, just like Wooly likes to sometimes describe his scenes, full of peril. And I love also, again, the Colonel's character design here, where he's looking through the window through his mop of hair, and his hair is so thick that he has to look through the window with one side eye. It's so clever how much personality the Disney animators put really into all of their characters and how apparent it is in this film. So much expression can be placed into the dogs, and especially Pongo and Perdita. Oh, the Colonel actually used both eyes. I stand corrected. For one quick second, he got that mop of hair out of his eyes. Oh. The puppies and Pongo and Perdita are reunited as they battle here in the Red Room. We start moving into sequence 14, which is Family Reunion, and that's directed also by Wooly Reitherman. Lots of background on Xerox in this audio commentary. In the Disney book by Jim Fanning, he provides some more background for the Xerox process. Each of the dog's spot patterns were designed like a constellation in order to maintain continuity frame to frame. With its sharp angles and thick lines, the art direction incorporated the sketchy Xerox look, giving the film the contemporary style of a sophisticated pen and ink drawing. The shock and awe of Pongo inheriting about 84 more puppies is quite a shock, I'm sure. I love how here in a minute they all gather together, and the animation of the dogs all going across the ice and snow is such beautiful and clever animation. The way they slip and fall, squash and stretch. It's a beautiful scene. D23 hosted a nice reunion with some of the stars of the film, including Lisa Davis, who, in anticipation of the Diamond edition of 101 Dalmatians, gave an interview, and she provided the unmistakable voice of Anita, the little article they have on their website says, with a quote from Lisa Davis. I must tell you, quite honestly, when I see it, the film, it still makes me cry. As many times as I've seen it, when the puppies are all out in the snow and lost and they're trying to find their way home, I still worry that they're not going to make it. And I know they are. I definitely know they are. Yes, what a wonderful experience to have had. I feel very fortunate. Also, in that same time period, they had actress Mimi Gibson as the voice role of Lucky, the puppy. The Dalmatian pup whose spots fall in the shape of a horseshoe. In the article, it goes on to say, she explains that she and the other kids who voiced the puppies read the lines for multiple roles and were essentially cast later. I didn't know who I was playing, and the others didn't know who they were, Gibson details. Gibson is happy to add the Diamond Edition to her collection of 101 Dalmatians themed items, which already included a beautiful Swarovski crystal pin. It's always fun to see my friends tell their grandchildren that I was the voice of a puppy in 101 Dalmatians, and they look at you and they can't quite figure out how I'm the voice of a puppy, she says. In Bob Thomas's Disney's Art of Animation from 1991, he has a quote from animator Tom Cito. There's a graphic sense you have to think about. You have to take note of where the audience's eye is. You have to lead their eye around. You'll notice in earlier films like Pinocchio and 101 Dalmatians, there are huge crowds of characters running around. Yet it never looks chaotic. There's a uniformity to it, a graphic uniformity to the frame. Some animators try to do crowd scenes, and it just turns into animated pasta. There's all this extraneous movement. You just can't see what's going on. Sequence 15 is Dairy Barn by Ham Lusk. The snowy scenes are very realistic looking due to the fact that real haze was superimposed onto the film for the snow falling and the wind blowing. It's amazing to see that they can do sorts of special processes like real film over the animated images. Martha Wentworth, the voice of Nanny in the film, also voiced Lucy, the white goose, as I mentioned, and Queenie, one of the cows that the Dalmatians encountered during their escape from Cruella here. Marjorie Bennett played Duchess the cow, and she would later play Miss Lark in Mary Poppins. I don't believe she speaks in that role, but it's her nonetheless. Princess the cow is voiced by Queenie Leonard, who was also previously a voice in the wonderful animated Walt Disney film Alice in Wonderland as the bird. Now that's the bird that is in the nest that starts squawking when Alice runs into her. Tom Conway provided the voice of the collie in this sequence. He also voiced the opening narration of Peter Pan previously. Notably, he was the brother of George Sanders, the voice of Shere Khan in The Jungle Book from Disney later. The cows, Queenie, Princess, and Duchess, are all the stalwarts of the dairy, to which the collie introduces 101 weary Dalmatians. They instantly fall in love with the myriad pups. En masse, the three cows are very reminiscent of the elephants in Dumbo, but although gossipy, they are very much more generous of spirit. Generous of milk, too. When they learn that the puppies are starving, they volunteer to feed all 99 of them straight from the horse's mouth. That's according to John Grant's Encyclopedia of Disney Characters, by the way. Quite more generous indeed. The elephants in Dumbo are not very nice. These sweet puppies get to now rest and relax after their long trek. A long way indeed as we enter into Sequence 16, Final Escape, directed by Woolie Reitherman. There are some deleted songs from the film. Mel Levin was the songwriter, and this sequence may have been planned to begin with the song Cheerio, Goodbye, Toodaloo, Hip Hip, which was written by Mel in October 1958. Taking a little bit of a detour from traditional Disney films, 101 Dalmatians isn't really a musical, although it does feature the songs. They really tried to make it more of a modern story that was not a musical. A passel of Dalmatian pups lived at the Walt Disney Studio for about a month so that the artist could have access to them and study them. In fact, actress Lisa Davis would spend an hour a day for several weeks playing with them in order to help get her into the part. Several other of the cast voice talent would play with them also and develop a stronger emotional bonds with their roles. There's some fun photos of behind the scenes of the Walt Disney Studio with those dogs. It's interesting to note that Mark Davis animated Cruella for every scene in this film. In a collaborative project like an animated film of this caliber, it's rare for something like that to happen. It was the last major animated production, really, that Mark did before moving on to Imagineering projects, such as Pirates of the Caribbean for Disneyland, although he did do some development work for The Chanticleer, a Disney film that never came to fruition. The Labrador here is played by Ramsey Hill. Charles Solomon's chapter in the Walt Disney Film Archives goes on to say, the relative simplicity of the backgrounds in Dalmatians meant the characters' movements, rather than their designs, made them stand out against the settings. Ken Anderson later recalled, I legislated to try doing a picture in Xerox. Then I went so far as to try to make one world out of the backgrounds too, because we draw things three-dimensionally in characters, and paint them flat. So I thought, we'll draw our backgrounds three-dimensionally and paint them flat too. We will also paint them with cell paint so that everything's in the same medium. I prepared a lot of things to show Walt. Walt didn't go for that, but in the meantime gave me the go-ahead to work on this. So we started on it, but without that facet. Animator Andreas Deja comments, it's much more pleasing to the eye when an art director presents a world that is so unified. In the films that preceded 101 Dalmatians, the characters were painted on cells with flat colors, while the backgrounds were heavily rendered. But in Dalmatians, it was one complete world. I think the animators felt more satisfied knowing that the backgrounds the characters would move in would be much in style with what they were drawing. Dalmatians background stylist Walt Paragoy said, a background creates a world for animated characters. It's the ambiance. There's a wonderful article on the Walt Disney Family Museum website. It's The Making and Impact of 101 Dalmatians by Parker Amoroso. 101 Dalmatians, it goes on to say, is unique in this respect. The artistic style of the film would never again be duplicated in its entirety, even as the Xerox process became the standard for decades to follow. For future animated features, the backgrounds drifted back towards the feel of earlier animated films, creating an almost hybrid style that had its own unique presence on the screen. As animation historian Michael Barrier explains, Anderson received screen credit for art direction on the next Disney animated feature, The Sword in the Stone, in 1963, but there is no sense, as in Dalmatians, that the boundary between the characters and backgrounds has been erased. Walt Paragoy felt similarly, noting in an interview that I kept Wooly Reitherman at bay on The Sword in the Stone, a film for which Paragoy was also the color stylist, but his attempt was to gel the Xerox lines against the backgrounds. There's no point in that. It's superficial that the film looks that way. Whereas in 101 Dalmatians, the black background lines often do not line up with the colors of the objects being portrayed. In The Sword in the Stone, the objects are outlined by the black lines perfectly. Paragoy continued, noting that the Aristocats in 1970 looks like a classically painted Disney film with Xerox lines on it. Of course, Paragoy may have been overly critical of the backgrounds in these subsequent films, but he's not wrong in his identification of their departure from the style laid out in 101 Dalmatians. The article continues to go on and say, of course, Anderson's work did not end there, and he would continue to be influential in later films. Anderson felt that eventually Walt looked past his initial skepticism of the film's look and warmed up to the picture. Recalling their final meeting before Walt's passing in December of 1966, Anderson recounted that years later, Walt left the studio as a sick man. I happened to be out on the lot and saw him. He had shrunk. He looked like a little man. Sure good to see you, I said. Sure good to be back, Ken. It's wonderful, he said. He was looking over the studio to see what was going on. The way he looked at me, I knew he was forgiving me for making 101 Dalmatians the way I did. I don't know how I know it, but he was forgiving me. Walt passed 2 weeks later. As I said before, I think Ken Anderson is genius in this film. The way the backgrounds look is stunning, and I don't think he could have done a better job. It is unfortunate that Walt felt the way he did, but it sounds like he came around. Cruella's car is an interesting piece of information to talk about. The model of Cruella's car is a real model. It was painted with black lines that make it look like a drawing when reproduced on the photostats. The image was cut out, pasted on a cell, and then copied by the Xerox process almost like a drawing, although it was a photo. The image was, processed, and once it was painted in flat colors, it looked just like any other cells in the picture. The live-action models of Cruella's car, and actually, Horace and Jasper's car, the little industrial truck that also is in the scene, they were created by artist Dick Lucas. They were filmed and used in the final frames of these frames of the film right here, in the film combined with animation and painted backgrounds. You can really notice the stiffness, especially when Cruella goes over the edge of the ravine and struggles to drive through the thick snowy hill, which in real life was sand that the model car was made to look like it was driving through. I love those reactions of the van driver as he has no clue what on earth Cruella is doing. And of course he drives away and Cruella ends up in the dump with Horace and Jasper. And we move into sequence 17, The Happy Ending, directed by Ham Lusk. Interestingly, Ham Lusk bookends the film with this sequence and the main titles. And surprise, it ends with Christmas, since it's the end of the year. The hit version of Cruella de Vil heard on the radio is sung by Jean Gale. She's the wife of composer George Bruns. I've always loved that the film ends with a joyous reunion and song during Christmas. For the final song, Dalmatian Plantation, screenwriter Bill Peet requested more wordplay with the suffixes Asian and Asian. So Mel Levin wrote the version that Roger sings in the film with lots of rhyming words. My friend Jim Fanning has written many books for Disney, and he has another great quote in his Disney Sing-Along songbook. The Dalmatians master Roger Ratcliffe is a songwriter, so it's ironic that 101 Dalmatians has only 3 songs, including the Canine Crunchies commercial jingle heard during the amusing cartoon sponsor break on the family TV, and Dalmatian Plantation, composed by Roger, in celebration of the bounty of bouncing spotted pups he adopts at the film's end. Tunesmith Roger also pens Cruella de Vil in mock homage to the crafty Cruella herself. The saucy blues sound and wickedly clever lyrics perfectly capture Miss de Vil's devilish personality. This sly little number helped establish Cruella as a wicked gal up to no good, and helped make the self-centered society woman one of Disney's most memorable villains. As we come to the finale of this commentary, talking about the legacy of 101 Dalmatians, Charles Solomon describes how Dalmatians opened to rave reviews. Time magazine described it as the wittiest, most charming, least pretentious cartoon feature Walt Disney has ever made. Dodie Smith wrote to Walt, "I thought the animation brilliant, the color beautiful, and many of the backgrounds almost beyond praise. Thank you, dear Walt Disney, and your whole studio, for making such a wonderful film out of my book." In fact, she felt that in many ways her story had been improved as a film adaptation. It was subsequently reissued 4 more times in theaters in 1969, 1979, 1985, and 1991. 101 Dalmatians remains a great fan favorite around the world, especially in Japan. It was released on VHS in April of 1992 as part of the Walt Disney Classics video series. And going on past the film, I will continue with a little more legacy information. It was re-released on March 9th, 1999 as part of the Walt Disney Masterpiece Collection video series. On December 19th, 1999, it received its first DVD release as part of Disney's limited issue series. A 2-disc Platinum Edition DVD was released in March of 2008. The film was released on Blu-ray in September of 2012 in the UK and in the US in February of 2015. Charles Solomon has some more background for us. 101 Dalmatians became the first animated feature to earn more than $10 million on its initial release. Re-releases brought that total to well over $200 million. Everybody loved the film, except Walt Disney. He may have disliked all of the attention going to a film which he had minimal input, as he had with Dumbo 20 years earlier. He hated Ken Anderson's Xerox lines that reminded viewers that they were looking at drawings. The stress likely contributed to Anderson suffering 2 strokes. While he was recovering, though, Disney sent gifts and kept him on the payroll. Anderson said he earned more while he was recuperating than he had while he was at the studio full-time. He worked on the later Disney features in Disneyland, despite Walt's initial dislike. 101 Dalmatians remains one of the most popular Disney features. Paul Felix says, "You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who'd say it's not one of their personal favorites. If it is such a strong graphic statement." Animation historian John Canemaker counters, 101 Dalmatians was a case of doing something right at the right time. But in his blind enthusiasm, Anderson misread Walt, who ended up displeased with a film, ironically, that saved the animation department from elimination. I say bravo to Ken. And like I mentioned, at least Walt eventually did forgive him. Something fun is that Dave Smith mentions in his Disney A to Z book, the famous Twilight bark used to rescue the puppies was later adopted as the name for the newsletter for Disney feature animation. 101 Dalmatians has a strong presence to this day, even throughout the years, in merchandise and in theme parks. Pongo is represented in the Main Street Firehouse at Disneyland Paris. Disneyland in California has a Dalmatian puppy represented on the Toontown Firehouse. A 101 DLMN license plate can be found in the Roger Rabbit Cartoon Spin attraction. Displays representing the film can be seen in various locations at different times, some being Main Street displays and the Disneyland Kennel Club displays. Characters have been seen in various fireworks shows, walk-around characters, parades, including some Main Street electrical parades throughout the years, and more. The Dalmatians play a major theme at a hotel in Disney's All-Star Resort in Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida. Other films that have been inspired to be made based on 101 Dalmatians are 101 Dalmatians, A Lesson in Self-Assertion in 1981, which was an educational film. You can watch that on YouTube. 101 Dalmatians live-action remake in 1996. Disney sing-along songs, Pongo and Perdita in 1996, which I have also found on YouTube. 102 Dalmatians, which was released in 2000, is a sequel to the live-action remake. 101 Dalmatians, the series, was from 1997 to 1998. I actually grew up watching that show and had a lot of fun with it. 101 Dalmatians 2, Patch's London Adventure from 2003 is the animated sequel. 101 Dalmatians Street was a new series debuting in 2019. And in 2021, another live-action take on 101 Dalmatians came out with Cruella, which is an origin story of Cruella de Vil, starring Emma Stone. D23, the official Disney fan club continues to hold events that 101 Dalmatians plays parts in. One such event that I was pleased to attend was D23 Destination D, celebrating 75 years of Disney animation in 2012, held at Disneyland. In attendance were Lisa Davis and Dave Frankham, who participated in a panel discussion about voice work. It was truly a pleasure for me to listen to them. In a D23 press release for the 101 Dalmatians Diamond Edition release, it reads, Disney fans might be especially eager to check out The Further Adventures of Thunderbolt. Owners of real pets already know that few things are cuter than watching their dog watch another dog on TV. And watching Pongo and Perdita's puppies as they follow the adventures of Thunderbolt is one of 101 Dalmatians' more adorable scenes. But the episode in the film ends with a cliffhanger. And for the Diamond Edition, Walt Disney Animation Studios created The Further Adventures of Thunderbolt, imagining how the sequence that so thrilled the puppies might have ended. This extension of the sequence was inspired by character drawings discovered at the Walt Disney Animation Research Library. And in case you were wondering, the show is still brought to you by Canine Crunchies. Animator and Disney legend Floyd Norman was involved in the making of The Further Adventures of Thunderbolt, and was an assistant animator at the time 101 Dalmatians was being produced. He says, I can't think of an artist here at Disney who wasn't excited about what we were doing on Dalmatians, because it was such a break from the past, such a change from the European fairy tales we had been doing. Now, all of a sudden, we have this new, bold, contemporary look, and it was like a breath of fresh air here at the Disney Studios. The artists that Norman speaks of, by the way, include such Disney luminaries as Nine Old Men animators Milt Kahl, Mark Davis, Ollie Johnston, Frank Thomas, John Lounsbury, and Eric Larson, and the color styling that was done by Walt Paraguay. According to Norman, the use of color was bold and different from things we had done before. Walt Paraguay brought a new design sensibility to this film. Since there are no traditional credits in a film from this era, I wanted to read off some more names. 101 Dalmatians, color styling by Walt Paraguay, backgrounds by Al Dempster and Ralph Hewlett, Anthony Rizzo and Bill Lane, directing animators Milt Kahl, Frank Thomas, Mark Davis, John Lounsbury, Ollie Johnston, and Eric Larson. Character styling by Bill Peet and Tom Oreb. Character animators by Hal King and Les Clark. Cliff Norberg, Blaine Gibson, and Eric Clayworth. John Sibley, Art Stevens, Julius Svedson, Hal Ambro, Ted Berman, Bill Keel, Don Lusk, Dick Lucas, and Ambi Paliwoda. Effects animators Jack Boyd, Dan McManus, Ed Parks, Jack Buckley. Directors Wolfgang Reitherman, Hamilton Lusk, Clyde Geronimi. Production supervision Ken Peterson. Running time 79 minutes. Special processes Ub Iwerks and Eustace Lysette. Sound supervisor Robert O. Cook. Film editors Donald Halliday, Roy M. Brewer Jr. Music editor Evelyn Kennedy. Music by George Bruns. Songs by Mel Levin. Orchestration by Franklin Marks. Story by Bill Peet. Art direction and production design Ken Anderson. Layout styling Don Griffith, Colin Campbell, and Ernie Nordley. Layout Basil Dadovich, Joe Hale, Dick Ung, McLaren Stewart, Dale Barnhart, Homer Jonas, Vance Jerry, Ray Aragon, Al Zinnin, Sammy June Lanham, and Victor Habouche. A couple additional deleted songs that Mel Levin wrote for this film were March of the 101 by Buddy Baker and Tom O'Dare, which would have been adapted by Mal Levin if they decided to use it, but that sort of transformed into his Cheerio, Goodbye, Toodaloo, Hip Hip that I mentioned earlier. And the other one that I think is particularly fun, you can hear all of these on the DVD releases, is Don't Buy a Parrot from a Sailor. Thank you so much for listening to my audio commentary, and I'm so thankful for you making it all the way to the end here. My name is Dean Brinkerhoff. I am a writer, historian, and I love Disney. I want to stress the importance of keeping these things alive and helping tell the stories of Walt Disney and the people who made up Walt Disney Studios. It is extremely important to me to keep their memories alive and to keep the magic going of how these wonderful films were made. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and check out my other content. I will have more audio commentaries on the way, and I have additional reading and sources you can check out here in the description of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time in On the Brink.